The wonderful thing about Malthus is not only that he came out with this, but then he completely shifted to Malthus Mark II, 2.0 in modern terminology. Because Malthus, the first version came out in 1798. And then he thought, let's check this out. This is the hypothesis. This is the prediction. This is my law. But what you do in science is you then look at the data. This is the hypothesis, the hypothetical. But then you looked at evidence, inductive. So he then looked around and surveyed, as was possible at that time, in the same way as Adam Smith and Montesquieu, all the civilizations and all the books about the world, Du Halde and books on China and India and reports from here and round and everything. And he wrote a book which was about 5 times the length. It was just called the second edition, and it came out in 1803, but it's a completely new book because he looked, and what he said was, what I said before was a law is in fact a tendency. It's a hypothesis. It's what you will get, all things being equal, but all things are not equal. And if we look round Europe in particular, England, he suddenly noticed, didn't conform to the Malthusian law. There had been, he saw, a long period before the sudden growth of population where population had not risen in the way that was predicted. Wealth had increased, but population had remained more or less level. He went to Norway and he found the same thing. He went to Switzerland and he found the same thing. So he said, there are pockets of places where they have escaped from my law and escaped from the tendency. How have they done this? And he said, they've done it by acting on the other side, not on the mortality side, but on the fertility side. They have reduced fertility. How have they done this? Well, they've basically done it in England and in Norway and in Switzerland by preventing childbirth. How have they prevented childbirth? They've done it by the responsible method of stopping people marrying until the economy could carry them. So you could not get married until you had sufficient means to support a family. This was Malthus's thing. Hold back until you can and then marry. And so, as was discovered later by historical demographers, the mean age of first marriage for women in the middle of the 18th century in England was 25. Now think about it, 25. In India at that time, it was 15. And you can do an awful lot of children in 10 years. And that is the big period. So if you cut the reproductive period for women by half, at least.
And you found, didn't you, that there was quite a big proportion of women that didn't marry at all, so didn't have any children.
Well, this was the other half. I mean, if you cut it in half,
Yeah.
that's from 12 to 6 is good. But then if you have the extraordinary fact, which was discovered later, that marriage in England was optional. In almost all societies, it is a stage of life. All women who are not, for some reason, unable to do so, marry, and they marry young. In England, you get this strange phenomenon of spinsterhood. People who do not marry, both men and women, up to, in the 18th century, a quarter, 1 in 4, never marry. The school teachers, the unmarried aunts, and so on. So it's a big phenomenon in Victorian England. And even now, many people don't marry. Now, if you went to traditional China or India and said, only half your daughters or 3/4 of your daughters are getting married, there's going to be 1 or 2, they would have been deeply shocked. You are not a full woman until you marry and have children. You must marry. Women must marry. That's their role in life. In England, their role in life is not marriage. You may marry, you may not marry. And so you marry because of this strange phenomenon of romantic love and so on and so on. But basically, if you combine optional marriage and high age at marriage and a moderately high mortality rate, not very high, you get more or less stable population. Now, the fascinating thing comparing this, as I did in my book, with Japan, is that they achieved the same result, that is more or less stable population for a long period, but they used an entirely different methodology. Malthus was very much for late marriage and for responsible behavior. I mean, young people won't know that until a generation or two ago, most middle-class people in England could not marry until they had got a secure living. My father, as a tea planter, wasn't allowed to marry on the first one or two of his times out there. And in many jobs in the bank and so on, you had to wait to marry. Now, in Japan, you didn't have this phenomenon. You had not very early marriage. You had sort of 18-year-old marrying, not the sort of 15, 16 that you find in a number of civilizations. But even at 18, you can have too many children in terms of this exponential. So what did the Japanese do? They did something which Malthus said was highly immoral. He was absolutely against it. And we call it neo-Malthusian. In other words, he would have disapproved of it strongly. He called it vice. And vice consisted of operating on conception, not mainly through contraception, though he was against contraception too, but there wasn't much of it available. But for vice for the Japanese was abortion and infanticide. And as I read through the Japanese sources, I was amazed at the huge emphasis on abortion and infanticide, because parents only wanted replacements for themselves. They wanted 2 or 3 children. And after that, and if they were of the wrong sex or whatever, they killed them. They either killed them through killing them in the womb or as they were delivered or afterwards. And one of the shocks I remember Sarah and I had when we went to Japan was going to Buddhist temples. And if you have a chance to go to them, you'll often find in the Buddhist grounds or in the temple hundreds of little images, often with a scarf around their neck or some decoration, that look like children. And when you ask what they are, people will say, well, those are things that are put up by mothers who've had to kill their children. Abortion, very high abortion rates, tragic. But the alternative was destitution, famine. So you choose. And this is something you find often on islands like Japan and so on. High rates of infanticide and abortion, the only way, given natural fertility and cohabitation, that you're going to keep the population down. So 2 different methods were used. But what Malthus had shown is that there is this, he is one of the great examples of something which we may talk about later, which is the importance of understanding tendencies in history. What you need as a historian is to have a model of what would normally happen, and then see the cases where it doesn't happen. And that gives you a problem. So tea was something that came along and altered the Malthusian tendency in a very dramatic way. And to end on population became the theme of my PhD, anthropology PhD, population and resources in Nepal. And throughout my life, I've reverted to the theme of population. I wrote a little book on Malthus, among others, because it interests my wife and I. Again, young people won't know, but we now are very aware of the ecological movement and how the world is running out of resources and so on. But people don't remember that when I was doing my PhD around that time, in other words, in the 60s and early 70s, there was a huge interest. There were books on the population bomb and so on by Paul Ehrlich and others. People were really concerned because it was obvious, and anyone can look. If you look at a graph of world population over 5,000 years, it goes like this, and then it goes like that. And we're still like that. Population growth is the most important problem facing human beings still, alongside the destruction of our environment. The two are linked together. Unless we deal with both, we're doomed. I mean, people say, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we've got science and so on. But if you extrapolate present population trends and it goes on as it is now, let alone what it was 20 years ago, within, say, I don't know, 400 or 500 years ago, the human biomass of human beings will be expanding out from the Earth at the speed of light.